And so he put a little, I think it was a piece of moose meat out on the ice with a rope tied to it, and then through his window, and then tied it to his arm or leg and went to bed.
Welcome to the Wild Dispatch! Hello and welcome to another episode of the Wild Dispatch. I'm just rearranging some furniture. Okay. I'm Robin and I'm back with more wild tales and surprising skills from the outdoors space. That was a catchy intro. We have another amazing guest today. I'm excited to introduce a new guest, someone who is a local, who I had a great chat with a little while ago, actually before going over to Colorado, which reminds me I should probably give an update on my last week over there. I am actually back in California now, but an amazing time was had, lots of lessons learned, and I can confirm I did have a pretty amazing, I guess the word would be incredibly close, bow-drawn encounter with a steaming, screaming, bush-shaking, massive elk. Monster thing. I have footage. I'm going to do a whole episode, actually. I was taking some voice notes from my whole trip, so I'm going to do that. I don't want to spoil the whole thing too much now, but that's a little tease. There will be another episode coming sometime soon once I've gone through all of the notes throughout the whole trip. Going from not knowing what the hell I'm doing, buying some elk mouth calls in the drive over to Colorado, to the moment of, everything coming together at the end. But that's not today's episode. Today's episode, as I said, we have a new guest, a fantastic adventurer. Monroe Robinson is his name. And he has done a whole bunch of fascinating things connected with the outdoors. He has traveled all over the place, has actually kind of been out in the wild, I guess from like top to tail in America in some capacity, definitely on the West Coast. He has spent a bunch of time up in Alaska, but also down here in California, which is how I was lucky enough to go visit him at his place and hear his stories. I should also say that he is perhaps, I don't say most famous, but he is more recently famous for having written a book about the homesteader Dick Proenneke. Monroe and his wife Kay spent 19 summers up at Dick Proenneke's cabin. If you don't know that story, I should maybe give a slight context. Dick Proenneke as kind of an icon of independent wild living. He, I believe in the 60s, traveled up to an area in Alaska called Twin Lakes and built his own cabin and his own way of life in a very kind of self-sustained, handcrafted way. He didn't really use any like motors or any tools of like an electrical or motorized nature. It was all painstakingly made by hand. And he had this amazing resourcefulness. So we are actually going to go into a lot more detail with Dick Proenneke in another episode, but I just thought I'd give that a little bit of context in case Monroe talks a bit more about it. This episode is going to be more about Monroe, his personal story, how he got so connected with the outdoors, and how he became so talented at building and being resourceful with materials out in Alaska and also down here in California. He's got some great stories. I'm excited to share them with you today. And that is a lot of waffling. Here's Monroe.
I tend to get, when I'm on the telephone, Kay's telling me, lower it sometimes.
This is like, bring it down a notch.
I'm like, oh, he's all the way in Colorado. It takes a lot of volume to reach there.
Well, there you go. Yeah, it's sound logic, right? That's how phones work. Okay, well, then I think we should begin.
Very good.
Okay, Monroe Robinson, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Robin. I'm very excited.
Good. I'm excited. Also, I want to say thank you for inviting me to your home to record this. It's very exciting. We're in Little River, is that right?
Little River, California.
Okay, there you go. And I figured maybe, I don't know, there's two ways we can do this. You can either do a little intro yourself, or, I wrote a few things down here as a nutshell of who you are, but I feel like I'm not going to do it justice. But that's why you're here, so we can get all the nuances of who you are in your story. But maybe I'll give it a go.
Yeah, you give it a go. Ask me a question. And
then you can correct me.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're a man of many talents, so tell me if I miss anything. I've got here craftsman, furniture maker, fine woodworker, redwood salvager, homesteader, cabin restoration expert, author, all-round adventure seeker, and nature lover. That's my list. Did I miss something?
Yeah, wilderness advocate.
Okay.
And then a really fun one. I was once dubbed the log cabin whisperer, and I say that just because I took a lot of pride in that one, because I think being called a whisperer of anything is not a title that you give to yourself, but something that somebody respects your work, for me, my craftsmanship.
Oh, yeah.
Enough to say that.
No one's ever called me a whisperer, so I can only imagine the honor.
Yeah.
Maybe one day, if I give it a few years. That's a good title, I've got to say. So I guess probably partly because of that title, I first heard about you at a local gathering nearby. Actually, we just talked about this before we started recording. But because I started this podcast, I don't know, around a year ago, and I was talking to the community that I often see on a Friday night that you're familiar with, your name did come up, and also your story about staying up in Alaska. I think that was the thing which is the easy thing to kind of present as your story, spending 19 summers up in Alaska at Twin Lakes, I believe, restoring a cabin that was created by Dick Proenneke.
Correct.
So I would say arguably you probably know more about Dick's life and that cabin than possibly anyone else in the world. You even wrote a book, which is here right now, The Handcrafted Life of Dick Proenneke. And while Dick was famous for his amazing story of self-sufficiency, and definitely I do want to talk a lot more detail about that, you also have more than your own fair share of great stories yourself. I can tell that from the couple of conversations that we've had. So this episode, I really want to kind of chat with you about your life, your experiences, and everything that kind of led to you having such an amazing connection with the wilderness and wild places. So I guess that wasn't really a question, but maybe we could go back all the way to the beginning of your story to, I believe, was it Arizona that you were born in?
Yes.
Okay. So tell me about your experiences of Arizona. What was it like there?
Yeah, I'm going to back up and correct one little thing.
What did I do?
That I feel like there are probably a great deal of people who knew Dick Proenneke and knew his life personally a lot better than I did.
Okay.
Or I do.
Okay.
If there's a part of Dick's life that I know the best, which I probably do, it's the handcrafted part, how he built things, and that's why I wrote that book.
And it's an amazing book, I have to say. I haven't had a chance to read it fully yet, and I look forward to digging in deeper.
but the level of detail, and even you can see the evidence of the combination, I guess. I'm getting ahead of myself. But the attention to detail of all of the objects that you helped recreate, and the attention to detail is unbelievable. And then that attention to detail is also in the book.
Right.
But we should probably give a bit of a context, actually, before we start your story properly, because I'm sure we'll probably refer to Dick many times.
Right.
And although Dick is definitely famous in some circles, it's probably helpful to just give a bit of an intro about who he was and what he was all about. Would you mind doing that, like the nutshell of what Dick did?
Some people think of Dick Proenneke as a person who lived the life that Henry David Thoreau wrote about. He lived in Alaska many years. He came from a farming background in Iowa, and but because of an accident when he was 50 years old that left him temporarily blind, he really wanted to live his life fully.
Okay.
And his definition of that was to go into the wilderness and see if he could build a cabin with all hand tools and put up with his own company for a year. So it was really an adventure that he started in 1968 at 52 years of age, and he liked it a lot, and that experience changed him a lot to where he actually gave up hunting, and even though he continued to eat meat, and lived up there for 31 years, building his cabin and everything in it with all hand tools, never had a chainsaw, never had a generator, never had any radio communication. Actually, really late in his life, he did become a volunteer ranger for the National Park Service when that land became part of a park, and so he would call in once in a while to headquarters and tell them what was happening at Twin Lakes. So he lived up there until he got too old to stay there in 1999.
Wow. So yeah, an amazing, and also he journaled everything as well, right? He wrote a lot of, I don't know, in England you call that a diary, but what would you say in America? A journal?
Yeah, I would think for Dick it's journaling every day.
Yeah.
And a voluminous amount. It amounted to 90 pounds or something of journals when he left.
Wow, and something like 7,000 pages, I think he said.
Yeah, transcribed.
When it was transcribed.
Yeah. And he also took a lot of photos, and he had a little wind-up, at first an 8mm Bolex movie camera, and later a 16mm Bolex camera.
Yeah.
And so he took film, and so the films about his life out there are edited by using his original footage.
Yes, okay, and I've seen some of those, and if anybody's listening, they want to check out some of those videos to get a bit of extra context of the cabin where Monroe spent a bunch of time, then you can go on YouTube, and if you just search Dick Proenneke, and you'll see in the show notes how to spell the name, but Proenneke is Wait, hang on.
P-R-O-E.
Okay, it's written there.
Proenneke.
Okay, that's how you spell it. Thanks, Monroe.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we have that bit of context in there. I think we'll see how we go for time today. We might tell a bit more of Dick's story today, but I think today is about your story, Monroe.
Okay.
So,
good.
Let's go back to Arizona.
Yeah, and you had asked me, where did wilderness come in here, I think, and the love of nature. And the short answer is, I don't know where it came. I just remember as a young adult, my parents always just said I would come in from school and drop my books on the floor or the table and head out the back door and would be gone until dinner time. And that was out on the desert, riding my bike or running through the desert, and always looking for birds' nests or lizards or anything that I could find. I've always been captivated by what was out of doors,
Yeah.
the wild. And it was a pretty rural area, so I could travel without ever seeing any houses. And
What part of Arizona was this?
the very southeastern corner of Arizona,
Okay.
so 70 miles north of Mexico and probably 50 miles, 40 miles west of New Mexico.
Okay. Okay. Was there a town nearby?
Wilcox. And
Wilcox.
Wilcox was farming country, a few cattle around there. Totally desert. You wouldn't have called that semi-arid. You would call it desert.
Okay.
And that part of Arizona has a lot of islands of mountains. So they're little mountains that are surrounded by desert. And the Chiricahua Mountains is one of the mountain ranges there. And there's a national monument there, Chiricahua National Monument there, that I moved to when I was 11 years old. And then that's when I really fell in love with wild places.
Okay. So that moment when you were 11, I guess I got lots of questions. Was your family also very outdoorsy before that?
My dad was a maintenance man, propane delivery person, worked at a pesticide fertilizer company, delivering chemicals from the train depot to crop dusters, little airplanes that sprayed pesticides on crops. And but every year he went hunting in the fall.
Okay.
And so that was, and once in a while he would go rabbit hunting or quail hunting, some smaller game than deer hunting.
So it was deer that he was chasing. Is it
Right.
Coos deer down there?
No, it was whitetail right in those mountains where we live, but in the greater area down there, mule deer, more closely related to the Pacific blacktail.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Did you ever go with him?
Oh yeah, every year. Yeah.
Okay.
From when I was real little, and then we went up in the mountains fishing too a few times during the summer, and I would ride my bike really frequently to little cattle ponds that had been dug on ranches or farms for water for irrigation.
Okay.
And those would be stocked with little perch and bluegill, little tiny fish, but for a little kid they seem like trophy fish.
And do you have memories of any particular hunts early on with your dad? Can you remember any stories?
I can remember one where Dad shot this deer at an amazingly long distance of, I don't know, certainly more than a quarter mile.
Wow.
And took it down with one shot, and then packing the meat out on a horse that was in control rather than me being in control. So,
were you riding the horse?
Yes, and I was riding the pack horse with the meat and the horns or antlers of the deer behind me, and the horse would run under any branch it could run under and catch me across the chest.
Just trying to get you off.
Yeah.
Did it succeed?
No, but other ones, I never had control of horses when I was little. So I have been swept off.
Have you?
Yeah.
Did you ever get hurt badly, or you were okay?
No, I was never hurt with a horse.
Okay. So you were saying that things really ramped up, because I'm guessing that was a bit younger when you were doing that stuff. Or I guess throughout with those hunting experiences. But you said you were maybe 11 when things really started ramping up. Was that when your dad got hired by the nearest? Is it a national park or a monument?
A national monument.
Okay. And what does that mean exactly? Well, do you know what the difference is?
Yes, they're both primarily within the Department of Interior, the National Park Service, and national monuments. A president can just declare a national monument.
Oh, cool.
And frequently that's how even national parks start as national monuments. The national parks require an act of Congress. And so, especially in today's world, then if you have a monument, a new president could annul that, take that away. But if it's a national park, it's my understanding it would take an act of Congress to take it away,
Okay.
to eliminate it.
So it's a bit more secure.
A little more secure. And so typically Yellowstone, Yosemite, Redwood National Park, Denali, those larger parks that everybody's heard of are parks, and some of the, I don't like to think of them as lesser ones, but lesser known parks or national places are monuments.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'm sure everybody knows that already. Well, maybe they don't, but because I'm not from America originally, that's definitely useful. I didn't know that. So
Yeah, and they're very different than a different classification than state parks.
Yeah.
That would be within that state.
Okay. That's a slightly different section as well. It's different subcategory.
Right.
Okay, so what was it about that time? You actually moved, I guess, did you say, when your dad got employed by the monument? And how did life change then? So you actually moved into the wilderness there?
Yes, into the housing of the National Park Service, which ended up to be really, even the housing was interesting. All the buildings, Chiricahua National Monument had a crew of Civilian Conservation Corps workers during the Depression in the 30s.
Okay.
And so all the buildings were made out of rhyolite stone, a soft granite type of stone that's sort of reddish pink color. Usually the bottom layer of stones on the visitor center in those homes were 4 feet in diameter, and then graduating smaller and smaller stones as you went up. So at window sill level in the house, it might be 2 to 3 feet wide, and then maybe a foot or 18 inches at the top. So the inside walls were vertical. The outside walls had a slope to them.
Okay.
And a timber frame roof. Really, I was fascinated with that. Lots of retaining walls that were stone, sets of steps, all the road improvements along the 6 miles of road at Chiricahua National Monument were made of stone, bridges and stuff. So I was fascinated with that craftsmanship, if you will, of the stone work and timber work. And then, of course, the wilderness, there were quite a few miles of trails there, but there was just unlimited space to run and see animals and birds. And Chiricahua was very interesting in that it's the southernmost terminus for quite a few animals and birds and plants in the northern part of the range of many, many birds and other animals. So it was sort of an important place for people. Bird watchers especially would come there to see these exotic birds.
So am I right in understanding what you're saying? Forgive me if I didn't quite get that. That you're saying that it's like the southernmost point of some locations where you can find certain species, and then the northernmost point of other species. So it's kind of like an overlapping bit of a Venn diagram almost of where all these animals can be found. Interesting. Okay, and I got here a little note that you had quite a few pets back in the day.
Oh yeah,
You took some of those animals that you encountered home.
Yeah, maybe one that I didn't tell you. I kept quite a few snakes. Including rattlesnakes, even took that all the way to college with me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I had 2 young coatimundes for a while.
What's a coatimunde?
Oh, gosh. So maybe a little bit related to raccoons. They had a ring.
Oh, like a ringtail cat.
No, not like a ringtail cat at all. Much larger than a ringtail, in the same size category as a raccoon,
Wow.
and very dexterous with their paws.
Do they have thumbs as well?
I should know that. I don't know.
Is it raccoons that have little thumbs too?
Yeah,
That's why they can get their little mitts and everything.
I wouldn't be surprised that coatimundes get into everything, and they climb mine were fairly young, and they didn't seem to be. I shouldn't say they didn't mind to be in captivity, but when I let them go after a couple of weeks, they hung around and they came back and saw me, and I would take them out with one on each shoulder on my bicycle when I had them, and they didn't run away when I did that.
They just stayed there.
Yeah. So they were maybe a real fun thing. I had a ringtail cat, you mentioned that, and it was cruel to keep it. It was an adult, and it wanted to
it wanted to get away.
Yeah. And I only kept it a little while. We had skunks for a while.
Oh, did you? I think baby skunks,
yeah,
right?
baby skunks, and that were too young to stink.
Oh, were they?
And later in life, I helped an Apache Indian man that had a skunk. I helped him deodorize it. That was pretty interesting. Take the odor glands out of the skunk for him.
Oh, wow. While it's alive?
Yeah, anesthetize it with a little ether from a spray can of starting fluid.
Yeah. Wow. So then you just got to figure out where that little sac is and do a little bit of surgery. That's so interesting.
I had a cage that was 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet that sat about 4 feet off the ground when I was, actually before I was 11 years old. And I kept birds in there. That probably wasn't very fun for the birds. I would catch them in little figure 4 traps and then put them in there. And I learned that about 40 little birds in there was a top number of birds you could keep.
Is it called like maximum capacity?
Yeah, you would put any more than that, and there weren't any more than that alive the next morning. So really, my childhood, I loved animals, but when I look back on it, I was really pretty cruel to animals too. I hunted and would shoot just about anything that I could get in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I think that's a young thing, right?
Yeah, well, it took me a little longer than young to get past it, but
I think I might not be past it yet. No, maybe I've got a little more than that, but I guess.
Yeah, it was a different time because
Exactly.
There was a game warden came by when I had all those birds, and I remember he was talking mostly to Dad, and I don't know why he was there, but he saw that, and he let us know that wasn't really legal to have wild birds in a cage.
Mm.
But there wasn't a heavy reprimand.
It was just a bit
about
of
it.
Information being passed on
Yeah,
to you.
and that did it. I let them all go then.
So, yeah, how did you
so
feel
it
when
was-
he said that?
Oh, really disappointed and couldn't figure out what I had done wrong. But things like that were really educational to me, and it made me think more about, well, I am keeping these birds in captivity, and I never had another bird,
Yeah.
a wild bird after that.
You said something before, about an Apache man, helping an Apache man with the with the skunk. Did you spend much time with the Apache man? Did you learn anything from him?
That was at Cherokee National Monument, and he advertised as being the last living Apache artist. His name that he went by was Manabear.
Manabear.
Manabear, and he so he had a little curio shop, and sometimes a squirrel or a skunk, several skunks around his little building there, and the skunks were pretty tame there anyway. They didn't really stink even when they had their gland. And he made a lot of things out of turquoise and a little bit out of jade, but there was a lot of turquoise in that part of Arizona.
Was there?
And so I went out with him one day that he was gone all day, maybe 50, 60 miles from Chiricahua, and purchased turquoise from a couple old men that were miners of turquoise. And so I made a lot of his jewelry that he sold as last living Apache artist when I was 12 and 13 years old. So lapidary work.
Yeah.
And that was really, really fun for me.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So did he teach you how to make so he was kind of freelancing the work out to you?
Yeah. I mean, he had a diamond saw and all the grinding and buffing wheels there in his little studio, and showed me how to do it, and I made the most simple little teardrop shaped things out of turquoise, mostly, little pieces that were maybe 3/8 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch, and maybe 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little thicker than that, and then would set them in the settings, silver settings, and sometimes larger pieces. When I look back on it, the turquoise I was working with was just amazing turquoise. It's not what is typically on the market today.
Yeah. We could maybe pause for a second. This is great, by the way. I'm really enjoying these stories. This always happens when I'm interviewing Isla as well.
Maybe the funniest thing he had a, and this we'll talk about his work too.
Yeah.
He had a 12 gauge shotgun that had been sawn off right immediately in front of the cartridge.
Wow.
And so it was a little pistol, and it had more of a Western cowboy style handle on it.
Okay.
So, and the person that sold it to him said that if he would shoot it once, that he would get 50% off. And so he had, and it sounds like it was a real experience holding a 12 gauge shotgun in one hand and firing it off. So then Manivare carved the handle down into a sort of a little more of a derringer, a rounded derringer handle that one hand would overwhelm the handle. And then he carved it into his Apache style and painted it and lacquered it was how he finished it. And then he had it for sale for quite a while, and also with the caveat that if the person buying it would fire it, that they would get half of it off. And I just remember that coming down there, and he was just laughing up a storm because somebody had come in and bought it and had fired it, and of course they couldn't hold onto it. It came right out of their hand. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see that myself. But he actually did a really nice carving of things, and I liked his little bears that he made, and the way he painted them and stuff. Yeah. So
another thing, I don't know which goes first. Let me think about this. So there's two things, and maybe you can decide which to answer first. I think, how old were you when you were at the Northwest School of Taxidermy?
That was prior to when I was 11, but not very much. And
okay.
I remember that because of we were still living in Wilcox, and I had sent them their money in and wanted to take the class and first they had written back and said that only people 18 years older and stuff could take the class, and so I waited about a year hoping that they would forget that I applied and sent them their money and said that I was 18.
Okay.
And so they sold me the classes. I still have the little lessons, 10 little lessons in a notebook. Yeah.
So
yeah.
is that how it works then? It's like
I guess once you finish one, then you have some exercise that you went in to, mounting a little squirrel or
yes.
One of them was on tanning, and that was the one that I actually used the most.
Okay.
And still use some.
Okay, you still do some tanning.
Yeah.
And interesting.
So you had to tan some hides and at least tell them the result. And
that's interesting. So you're like 11 years old and you're learning how to...
Yeah, and the graduation thing, you had to send some photos of your taxidermy work, and I remember I had caught a couple of little burrowing owls in their underground hole, and had them at home, and I had one sitting on each side of a little cactus lamp that I had made, a piece of cholla cactus that was basically horizontal with the light coming out of the middle, and the little owls were sitting on each side, and I thought, well, that looks like it's mounted, so sent them that photograph, and they said that they needed some further example of my work. So I never really graduated, but I got all the classes, and that's what I was interested in. So I was faking I thought these owls look beautiful, much better than I could have mounted them, and then I let them go.
Okay, so they were alive, the owls.
They were alive. And maybe they were 5 inches tall, maybe?
Yeah.
They were pretty small.
So they were just... Yeah,
sitting there on each side, looking at the camera. They just looked like perfect little mounts on this.
Nice. Okay. So I guess that makes sense then, but the two things that I was going to ask, I thought that maybe was later. But the other thing I was going to ask was I remember reading this in your book, that one of the things at the monument when you spent time there was that you discovered a map of caribou migration. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I can. Boy, that was... So the school that I went to for my 7th and 8th grade there was in a ranching community where each of it was one extended family, the Riggs community that had homesteaded all of that country in the late 1800s.
Okay.
And it was the Riggs grandchildren that had the various ranches when I lived there, and the great-grandchildren. And so they had a private school, if you will, and it was, and they allowed us Park Service people to be a part of that. And it was 8 or 9 students, 1st through 8th grade, with a single room and a single teacher, and the maps that they had there, a world map and then a North American map, were probably something that had been recycled out of larger schools decades before.
Yeah.
And I just remember unfurling the map and seeing all of northern Canada and all of northern Alaska just had uncharted written on it, and it did have the Yukon River, and it had the Mackenzie River and Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake, and so even before moving to the monument at I don't know what age, but before 10, before 11, I had been really fascinated with buffalo and really wanting to witness herds of buffalo, and just feeling just so devastated that was never going to happen, that buffaloes had been wiped out. And So it was about that time of seeing that map that I became aware of caribou in the North Country, and I imagined that uncharted place to be where the caribou lived.
Yes.
And nobody ever talked to me about it, but that was my imagination. And so I've always wanted to go to Great Slave Lake and the McKenzie River, and then it was that energy that got me to go to Alaska when I was 19, and then live up there for years. And it was also the energy of my wife, which I will say more about late as we go on. But
Yeah.
she had her own stories and fascination with that same North Country of Great Slave Lake and the McKenzie River from her childhood. So
Okay.
two summers ago, we went and kayaked in the Great Slave
Oh,
Lake.
amazing.
And that was really, really fun to do that finally.
Oh, that must have been incredible.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of footage of Great Slave Lake and always thought it looks so stunning there.
Yeah, it was, yeah. And we went that same trip, we finally flew into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge where the largest herd of caribou now live. And that was another for 2 weeks of hiking up there.
Okay, and you just were mingling with the migrating herd.
Yeah, and the bears and the moose and wolves and
Amazing.
yeah.
There's one little step I have here, which I was curious about. Before we get to Alaska, I know I want to talk a lot more about Alaska, obviously, but you went to Colorado University, is that right?
I went to Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So was that part of the heading to wilder, more kind of green environments? Was that part of what your motivation to go there, or what made you think about going there?
It ended up to be, I didn't really, nobody in my family had gone to college, so I wanted to go to college more maybe out of rebellion. I wanted to do something. I had no idea what college was about.
I don't think many people. I love it. It's so counter to what we might normally think. It's good.
Yeah, I didn't come from an educated family, and in my senior year of high school, going to the counselor, I told the woman that I wanted to go to college, and so she really recommended I go to the local junior college, and I'm like, no way, I'm going to Colorado State, and I want to go to the school. But I didn't have any idea what I wanted to study either.
Okay.
So I signed up for electrical engineering because I liked math.
Okay.
I was a whiz at math, but I was also paying my own way through school, and I ran out of money after 2 quarters, and even halfway through the first year, I saw a slideshow of summer jobs in Alaska, and it was counting salmon. Counting red salmon up in Bristol Bay, the largest salmon rivers in the world. And
quick question. Oh, 2 things actually. One is I can just hear. I think you're picking, and I don't. I mean,
no, I can.
It's just one of those just picks up in the sound, which might. I don't know. It's probably nothing, but it might be. Sometimes you can be like in the audio.
Good.
You'd be like, wait, what's that noise? Okay, the question I was going to ask is, what year was this at this time that you were at college?
I started in '64.
Okay.
And so I went up to Alaska the first time in '65 when I was 19 to count salmon. Yeah.
Okay, so that was your job, counting salmon.
Right.
So
and to get that job, I went up after that slideshow of job opportunity, summer jobs in Alaska, and the guy said mostly it's juniors and seniors, but sometimes they would hire freshmen if you dropped out spring quarter and went up there early, because none of the college students wanted to do that. And that worked well for me because I didn't have enough money to finish my first year of college anyway.
Yes.
So, and then he asked me what my major was, and I said electrical engineering, and he said, well, forget that. And I asked him, well, what would help? And he said, well, biology or even forestry, fisheries would be the best. So I went over to the registrar's office and changed my major the next day to fisheries and applied for that job and got it. And so I was never wedded to work in fisheries, but fisheries was my avenue to get to the wilderness of Alaska.
That seems very simple. I like that. I like the thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, so that must have been interesting, like a totally different environment. Oh, I guess Colorado's maybe is closer definitely to Alaska than Arizona, that's for sure. But it must have been quite an experience getting over there and just jumping in at the deep end. And I mean, how do you even count the, is it sockeye salmon?
It was the first river that I happened to be on the first 2 years was the Kvichak River, which by some odd luck is the largest salmon river in the world. And,
wow, okay.
In 1965, my first year there, was the largest number of sockeye salmon ever recorded in the Kvichak. So the largest number of fish going up any river to spawn ever recorded. It was over 23 million sockeye salmon came up, and that was after the commercial fishery caught nearly 25 million fish.
Yeah.
So it was counting with a little hand counter from a tower, a 20-foot high tower on each side of the river, looking down into the river, and we used an expanded metal grate about 4 or 5 feet wide, painted white, that was put down on the bottom of the river each spring. And that made the bottom of the river light in color so you could see the fish running over it.
Okay.
And we counted 10 minutes out of every hour, 24 hours a day, to count the number of fish, and then multiply it by 6, and you get a rough idea how many fish are coming by. And we counted ones, and then when the run started, within a couple of days, you couldn't click that fast. And so a biologist flew out and showed us how to count in groups of 5, 10, 15, 20. And we each stood up there and counted and correlated our counts. And almost immediately, all of us were always within 10% of each other.
Wow.
And it was only a day or two after that we couldn't click fast enough in groups of 5. So called in and they said, well, figure it out. And then so the 4 of us would get up there and count in groups of 10. And it was very quick that we were all within 10% of each other in being able to estimate groups of 10.
Wow.
And so that's how we counted them. And
so roughly ballpark then, in 10 minutes, how many fish were you counting in groups of 10? So it would be like 1 click for every 10 basically, and then you'd multiply by 10.
It was really, really fast that you were clicking 10. And I remember one day was 2.4 million fish, and one day was a little over 2 million fish. So there were 2 days over 2 million. And so I don't know how you could do the math.
Oh, I don't think I can, but that's a lot.
Break that down. Yeah, it was a few thousand fish anyway.
Wow.
In 10 minutes.
Wow. So how long were you doing this kind of 1 foot in Colorado, 1 foot in Alaska studying?
I was on the quarter system, so I could get two-thirds of a year of school each year. And it took 6 years to get my degree then.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. It was fun to go do something that I was just super, super excited about, and paid my way through school. And 1 year was enough extra money that I could buy a camera with a telephoto lens and a wide-angle lens, and one year buy a bunch of rock climbing equipment, and another year buy a really state-of-the-art racing bicycle and raced bicycles. So I could both, and it's one of the sad things about today that college is so expensive. I can't imagine a young person working and making enough money to pay their way through school now, and it was totally feasible for me to do.
Yeah, that's a whole side of things which I don't have that much perspective on, coming from England where education's a little bit different. I mean, you still have to pay now, but it's definitely a little more controlled, I think.
Right.
Subsidized and all those kinds of things.
I mean,
so I feel so lucky that I got in before it got more expensive than it is.
People come out with student loans that are so expensive that it affects decades of their adult life. And I did have a $2,000 student loan that I really didn't have to have, but I did.
Yeah. But it's a difficult system, isn't it? If you have all that debt, then it's going to affect the decisions that you're making, and it might. I can only imagine that it might influence choices that you make in going after things that you want to do in your life, right? If you want to go have adventures in Alaska, for instance, but you've got a bunch of debt, that might change the way that you want to approach things.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a tough reality, I guess, nowadays. You said something which I'd love to ask you about. You said you bought a bunch of climbing gear, and there was a note somewhere in your book about climbing ice cliffs. Mm-hmm. Tell me a story about that.
You know, I probably climbed more mountains and rocks than I did ice, but
Okay.
I climbed ice a few. I think the most difficult piece of ice was a waterfall about 50 feet high that had a little section of it that was steeper than vertical.
Ugh.
And we managed to get up that.
Yeah. So that was that was in Alaska, right? I'm guessing.
No, that was in Colorado.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, and most of my climbing was in Colorado. And most of it was in the winter because that's when I was going to school and working in Alaska during the summer.
Yes, because it's not so practical to be over there.
So there was quite a bit of snow and hard-packed snow that was so hard you would call it ice climbing for climbing Long's Peak, one of the 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, climbing the east face of that in the wintertime. And
that sounds epic.
It sounds terrifying to me now.
Does it?
Yeah.
But that was just what you did for fun then?
Yeah.
Did you ever have any moments where you kind of like, oh, that was a bit close?
There were times that at least one time on Long's Peak, that I knew that I was going to die. And
really?
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
It was actually before I got climbing gear and learned anything about climbing.
That's the dangerous time.
And climbing, and my friend had enough wits to say that he was turning back and wasn't going to climb. And so I came across some other idiot that was trying to climb it, and the two of us went up until we couldn't, on the north side of Long's Peak, and along a route called the cable route, because there is a steel cable, but it was mostly buried under ice.
Okay.
And we got up high enough that I couldn't go forward anymore, and I couldn't go down either. And I just thought, well, I remember saying if there's a God out there and he or she listened to me, that I would do whatever they ask. Yeah, I didn't think I would make it off of there.
So what happened? How long were you stuck for?
Just a few minutes, because I was in such a precarious place that I could have slid.
Yes.
And just fallen. And there was a boulder that was anchored in the ice and part of the mountain that was maybe 50 feet below me and 10 feet off of straight down.
Okay.
And I thought, well, if I can run into that boulder, that boulder would stop me.
If you slide down.
Well, I had to get horizontally 10 feet too.
Yes. Okay.
And so the other man was willing to stand in front of that rock and help catch me if I could get there. And so he got there and got lodged in strong himself, and I basically ran for it. I started moving across the mountain in a somewhat controlled, real quick little steps and just going for it.
Yeah.
And just slid, fell, scrambled those few feet sideways and crashed into him and that boulder.
Sure.
And then the route was a little easier, more secure from there on down. But
and you got spikes on your shoes as well at that point?
No,
Oh,
we had no
Oh, because
gear.
this is before equipment.
Probably street shoes.
Ugh.
Yeah, there's always, for young idiots climbing, there's always those close calls there.
Yeah.
On Mount Baker in Washington State a few years later, falling in a crevasse and coming off the mountain in a small avalanche.
Wait, this happened to you?
In one day. And the third day that we were climbing there. And so there were just, I don't know, I've certainly had more than 9 lives and didn't have the smarts to really be here.
Wow.
But the thing is, for the most part, those times when you get yourself in a pickle, I became very present rather than frightened.
Yeah.
The fright and thinking what an idiot I was came later.
Yes.
But in the moment, I remember coming off the mountain in the avalanche, and there was no fright. I was present. I was swimming.
You were swimming?
Swimming, and on the top, trying to.
Yes.
Doing everything I could do with my arms and feet to kick and stay on top.
Yes.
And that's where you are.
Wow.
There isn't any fright to that.
That's so interesting.
That comes later.
And it's good that you did that, because actually I've interviewed someone who's para jumper, who Dennis McIver, I don't know if you know him, he lives nearby. But that's one of his tips if you're in an avalanche. He said the theory is try and swim.
Yeah. You face up the hill and you swim.
That's amazing.
And I thought I did a great job until it stopped, and I was buried up above the waist, below the shoulders, but 2/3 of me was buried, and my feet were down in it.
Okay.
I was basically in a vertical position, and so if the avalanche would have kept going
more,
hardly any further, I was on the way under it.
Yeah.
I didn't know it until I stopped. So it saved me in that it was a very short. I only went maybe, I'd say less than 200 feet. So not a roaring avalanche.
So what's that, like 60, 70 yards, something like that? Mm-hmm. It's still far enough.
Yeah.
I don't think I would choose to be in any avalanche whatsoever. No. Wow. That must have been a moment. So you were able to dig yourself out then?
I was.
Okay.
Took a while. But I got out by my friend who was up above me that wasn't part of the avalanche, then had to climb down that same section. And I was out before he got down there.
Yeah. Wow. You got some stories that trip.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question. Two things. One is when we talked last, we were in your wood shop, and there was a caribou skull mounted on the wall. I would love to know the story behind that caribou skull. And I guess, did you taxidermy it yourself if you did the taxidermy course?
No, that skull is just the skull cap with leather over it.
Okay.
And with the antlers on a backboard. I'm not sure why I didn't do that. I know. It had velvet on it when I shot it.
Did it?
And I didn't know. I wanted to save the velvet, and so I took it to a taxidermist, thinking that they would save the velvet.
Yes.
And so they mounted that and put the leather over the skull cap. But weren't able to save the velvet, so they took it all off.
It's supposed to be pretty hard it's fragile stuff apparently, right? You've got to like spray it with a certain, I've read about it.
I don't really know how you would do that.
Apparently there is actually Isla, guest of the show, had a theory about that. I think he said if you spray it with a borax solution, that helps. You need to get something over it to like lock in whatever's going on in there, apparently. If I'm remembering correctly, this could be wrong. Apologies, Isla, if that's incorrect. Yeah.
And probably the closer it gets to the time that they're shedding it,
it gets worse and worse.
It's probably harder to save.
Yes. So this was in Alaska then, I'm assuming. And so how long were you hunting for at that time? Because I remember...
I think we were out maybe 5 or 6 days that trip. And...
what kind of area?
There were some glaciers and high mountains, and we had actually flown out there to hunt Dall sheep and hadn't found any.
Okay.
And so in the lowlands, the rolling hills, there were a large number of caribou, and so that was
the backup plan.
The backup plan, and I had gotten to a place where I didn't like the idea of trophy hunting.
Yes.
But I wanted the meat.
Yes.
And so my partner that I was out with was into shooting something big. So I just he shot first and killed a caribou, and then realized it wasn't the biggest one in the herd. So I don't know why I shot the big one, but I did. It was certainly the one that stood out, and you knew what you were shooting at.
Yes.
And so.
So did you swap, or was that the big one there?
That's the big one.
So you kept that one. It's interesting, isn't it? I also have feelings of like not really feeling like a trophy hunter myself. I mean, I actually had conversations with previous guests about this exact thing, like the language used, like the idea of trophy hunting. It's quite a contentious subject and has a lot of emotion tied up in it. And I don't, I mean, I know I've said this before, but I don't probably have the talent to be a trophy hunter with a bow and arrow right now. What does they say? Beggars can't be choosers. Probably an inappropriate term to use these days, I guess. But there are moments when you see magnificent creatures, like you said, that just stand out, that for some reason capture your imagination as part of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, going on an adventure like that, a multi-day hunt, where you're not just, I mean, you're going for the meat, but you're also going for the adventure, right? And the experience and the whole thing. And there are just some animals which are part of that. You see them and you're like, I had the same experience with an enormous warthog, which I'm yet to cross paths with again in South Africa. But I had a couple of close encounters. Yeah, there's just, for some reason, there's a bit of a moment sometimes, isn't there?
Yeah, but I went hunting several times with the same man up in Alaska, sheep hunting each time.
Yeah.
And one time I was in a full curl and larger sheep hunt.
Yes.
And I drew out for a permit, and my friend did not, but his little, 12-year-old son or something drew a permit.
Oh, okay. For a doll sheep.
For the three of us went up there, and I found a herd and watched them for several hours. I think I told you that the other day, and the rams were butting each other, and a hoary marmot came along and was saying, "You're in my territory." And so watched that for several hours, and then went back to camp, and so the three of us went out, and there was one ram that was a curl and just a magnificent animal. And then there were two others that were right at one curl.
Okay.
And so Ricky, the boy, I thought, well, the only thing safe for him to shoot is the really largest one. And it had actually rolled and routed around in some dirt and mud, and it was a little brown in color.
Okay.
So for various reasons, it just stood out. And so we got really, really close to those. And
how close would you say?
Maybe 50 yards.
Wow.
Right on. You can approach doll sheep. They actually do have wolves that approach them from above. But if you approach doll sheep from straight up above, you can walk straight in on doll sheep sometime.
Because they don't look up.
They do look up. They see you, but they don't really mind it.
Interesting.
They don't really see you as a threat. You can't do that from below.
Yeah.
And I've done it other times, but not every time that I've tried to do it does it work. But that time it did. And being Ricky was there, I thought, well, we'll try. And we got really, really close. And so Ricky shot first so that he would have his ram.
Yeah.
And then instantly when he shot, then I took my ram that dropped on the spot. But Ricky missed.
Oh, no.
And so the rams ran a few feet and stopped, and he shot again. And then they ran, and they circled around us to where they were right above us, maybe 100 yards away. And Ricky had emptied his gun and never hit it, and then wanted me to shoot it or his dad, and neither of us would.
Oh.
So there was a time when I was glad that I hadn't shot the big one, and the big one was left to
it got away.
To get away, and mine was a little over a curl. But that was a time. Then we spent 3 days. We spent that day we took care of my ram, and then the next day hiked out, and then we had to sit with it waiting for an airplane for another couple days, and keeping that meat good. And it was then that each of the times, it's the things you see when you're out watching animals that I loved. It wasn't the shooting, and it wasn't even having the meat. And so after that hunt, I decided I would go out and just watch animals once a year, because to me, going hunting was the excuse.
Yes.
But it got you to do it each year.
Yeah.
And it was such a treasured time. The fact is that when I quit hunting and decided I would just go out and watch and photograph, I didn't do that then.
Interesting.
And it wasn't until I started going up to Dick Proenneke's cabin that my wife and I, Kay Schubeck and I, had this love of watching animals, and we've sat for 2 weeks once in front of a fox den, and hours and hours and hours in front of Dall sheep and just watching them through the telescope or without the telescope. And just watching animals just fills me with something. And quite frankly, and I videoed all of that experience at Twin Lakes.
Yeah.
So I have video of these amazing animals and sometimes doing amazing things. Wolves or brown bears catching ground squirrels right in front of us or whatever. So, and that's really where I am today and have been for the last few decades of either watching or taking video. And we learn a lot more about the animal and their life by watching the video than we ever did watching it in real life.
Really?
Yeah, because you get to see something in some level of detail that just happens so quickly in life that you don't really get to understand what's happening.
Yes. I think you're right. Like, there is a subtlety. I think when you have one of those experiences when you're close to an animal, it's like a bit of, I don't know if it's an adrenaline spike or something happens chemically. It's a fantastic moment, like you described. Like, watching animals is at least for me, maybe this is why I have this podcast, but it's a moment of complete focus. You're not distracted by other thoughts or things that you might be worried about in your life or the regular expectations or pressures that you have, on your shoulders, whatever they may be. In that brief moment that you are in an interaction watching an animal, that all goes away. And it's just like a pure kind of calm, not even necessarily calm sometimes if you're, depending on what the animal is, but it's a pretty amazing thing. I don't know if that's how you experience it.
Maybe the best example of showing where you learn, we've got really good at finding fox dens up in Alaska.
Yeah.
And we had found about 12 fox dens in the Twin Lakes area and would go back to those every year. And once stayed for a week and another time for almost 2 weeks in front of a fox den every day.
In morning and evening or?
Usually just hours and hours, maybe 16 hours a day for all that time. And then one time Kay needed to leave once to go back up to the Dick Proenneke cabin, and I was left there at a fox den with 6 little ones and thought, well, I always wanted to spend a whole night and see what happened at night. And it was already afternoon that we had sat there. So and without any extra food or anything extra, and our tent a half a mile away, that was I thought, well, if I'm ever going to do it tonight, right now is the time to do it. So just stayed there 24 hours, actually longer than that. And just watched it all night. But you know that people know that wolves are social animals. They have that reputation of being more of a social animal than a lot of other animals. And we also watched wolf dens year after year after year. One den in particular we watched for, I don't know, over a course of 8 years every year.
Yeah.
And so rewatching those videos, you get to see how the parent wolf comes in with food that it's eaten. I've never seen, they may do this, but we never witnessed where they brought in a big chunk of meat in their mouth.
Yes.
They bring in meat that they've chewed up and they regurgitate it. And they have enough sometimes to regurgitate to several little ones, the little pups. And what a contrast that is to foxes that don't regurgitate and are not the social animal, that the foxes bring a squirrel or a duck or whatever it is in and drop it to the first kit that arrives, regardless of which kit had it the previous time. So one of the years when there was 5 little kits, one of them died in the week that we were there, because if you fall behind the curve, then you're probably the little kit that stays in and sleeps a little longer, and you miss out the next time too.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon one of your siblings, if you get something, the sibling is strong enough to take it away from you. And if that happens, then you're just doomed.
Yeah.
And also the little foxes are, you just see their relationship with their siblings. They're fighting, sometimes aggressively. Their play is fight, and they have very sharp little teeth, and they're just at each other all the time. But one family of foxes is maybe not quite as aggressive as another one, and you get to see that. But then go back to the wolves, and you see that socialness of those animals. There is some fighting with the pups, but not the same level of fighting as with foxes. And there's a lot more of the wolves' pups just laying around and being next to each other, that social supporting each other animal. So you get to we learn so much about all the animals by re-looking at our video.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's I actually was just reading a book. I don't know if you're familiar with books by Tom Brown Jr. But I believe that when he was young, spent a lot of years following kind of in the footsteps of, and this is in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, but following in the footsteps of an Apache man whose name's Stalking Wolf. And something he says is spending a huge amount of time, like you said, like sometimes even 24 hours, just observing animals. You gain a level of understanding and a nuance and a subtlety of connection with nature that most people just don't have because they're not aware, not able to take the time to see the difference. So yeah, it's interesting. It's an observation which people seem to be, or I've heard people realizing as they spend more time with nature. I mean, actually, Tom Brown Jr. would spend 12 hours looking at a track just to see how it would change with time and wind and rain and just seeing how it evolved. But that level of patience, I think, is not common amongst most people.
Yeah, I mean, with both Kay, it's not something that my wife Kay does to support me. It's both of us love doing that.
Yeah.
We have a habit of looking at scat in that same way that you spoke of looking
I
at.
also find it fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And that how many animals leave their scat right next to some other animal, not just of the same species.
Yep.
But and not all, up in Alaska it was the fox and the wolf and the lynx. Sometimes the weasel too.
Really?
Would leave their scat right in the
Middle of the path.
Well, right next to where some other animal, some other carnivore had left their scat. Usually at a dominant rock.
Yes.
And then the scat inhabiting moss that would then grow only there and on old scat. But bears didn't do that. They didn't partake in that.
Yeah.
Otters wouldn't leave their scat on those same marking areas, but wolves would leave their scat where otters had left theirs. So sometimes it was a one-way thing. Mostly otters wouldn't leave their scat, or partly otters wouldn't leave their scat where these other predators left theirs, because they have their own trail system.
Okay.
They didn't use the trail of foxes and wolves. And
yes, they're not just following the same path.
no, they have their own little paths. And
interesting.
so all of those things were really, really fun. And it's what here we go out, we carry our binoculars when we go out hiking, and we like watching. We don't count birds. We don't care how many or what birds, whatever bird or animal we see, being able to watch it is what we're interested in doing.
Yeah. We are getting a little ahead of ourselves. It's fun. We always jump around different places, and I love, I love scat. It's a strange sentence, I realize. But there is something I did want to ask you about. But maybe we should just have a little break for a second.
Okay.
I'm going to do a bathroom break. Do you need to?
Good.
Do you need a break? Let's do a quick pause for a second.
Okay.
Still comfy?
Yep.
Okay, good. So the funny thing is, now I said I have a question and I don't remember what it was. Okay, let's make sure I'm all set up properly. I think that looks good. I remember now. The question I was going to ask you is that you were telling me some stories about hunting adventures whilst you were in Alaska. But you were also working over there, right? And so you were kind of making a living. You moved over there
Correct.
after a while. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about that. I've got a thing here about that while you were studying at some point, I think you helped someone build a cabin, and that was kind of the beginning of working in Alaska more. Is that right? Or is that a slight misunderstanding?
I went up to Alaska 6 years, just 6 months a year, basically. And then once college was over in 1970, then I moved up to Alaska and lived up there permanently until I came down to the Mendocino coast to go to the Jim Krinoff's woodworking school.
Okay.
But I think the cabin that you're talking about is that the third year that I was up in Alaska, a man came in and asked which one of these 50 college students that are counting fish in all of Bristol Bay is a really hard worker, and the biologist there said, talk to Monroe. And so that I had met Jay Hammond before that time. He was actually the bush pilot that flew me in each of the years when I was counting fish. Flew me into the wilderness. A big man with a heavy beard, and I just thought of him as this really nice bush pilot. But he was also a local politician. I think he was probably he had been a borough mayor, but I think he was a state senator then, and later became governor of Alaska. And so he wanted me to do some building for him. He wanted to have some material moved on a lake. And and so he flew me down there with a few days' supply, loaned me his gun because the Kargulik River was just known for this really high brown bear population.
Okay, wow.
And so I got there, and the materials were down the river several miles and then across Basharoff Lake, and which is a usually really stormy lake, and so he dropped me off with a little pop tent and a few days' supply of food and a little yellow piece of paper that he had drawn the outline of a little cabin that he wanted. And so I went to bed that first night. It was raining, and I couldn't sleep because of the fear of brown bears, and so there it's the land of the midnight sun. It's not sun, but it's it's enough light that you can see.
Like dusky.
Yeah, and so I just got in this little boat. It was a flat bottom river boat with a jet lower unit on the outboard motor to go in really shallow water, and motored down to Basharoff Lake and over the waves of the lake and found the materials that he had there. And he had asked me to just get, if I could stay there a few days and get a calm day and go down and haul back several loads of material. And
what was the material?
It just 2x4s and some metal roofing and some nails and just things to build a little cabin.
Yeah.
For him to use as a hunting cabin for bears.
Okay.
And so I did that and got the first load up, and I wasn't any more sleepy then than I had been for the previous one. So I worked throughout the night. I think it was 3 loads of materials. And it was dark enough by probably the second and third load that I couldn't see to motor back up the river. And so I would pull the boat up those few miles and just be in the river waiting and got the materials up there. And then I started building this cabin, and I had never done that before. Didn't know much about it. Found out about how to make things square because there was some plywood for the floor, and you had to have the joists on the floor square for the plywood to lay out and give you a place to nail the edges to. So I learned about squareness out of
the hard way.
And so by the time that he returned, I had the floor down and some of the walls up, and he asked me if I minded staying there and finishing it. And I'm like, I didn't really want to, but
okay, so
I did, and so I built that little cabin for him.
So why did you? I guess you weren't really hoping to impress him and you weren't hoping to get the gig to finish the cabin. You just wanted to do a good job.
I didn't know how to say no to him, and I needed the work to go back to school, and I didn't want to disappoint somebody.
Yeah,
I always tried to work really, really hard and do my best, really so that I didn't get reprimanded, maybe from some childhood thing. It was not a comfortable place to be, though. There was another little cabin there that had a terrifying history of a wildlife bear photographer there with a woman that was staying there with him, and it sounds like it was maybe springtime. I'm not sure.
At the same, like a different year, or the same year? That
no, it was many years before I was there.
Okay.
And the couple didn't get along, and the story from the woman was that they were having a fight, and he said, "Well, if you don't like it, then why don't you just shoot me?" And so she obliged him and blew him away in the cabin, and so the cabin was filled with 16 millimeter movie film that had never been taken out, but it leaked. The whole cabin, there wasn't any place to sit in there or lay down. That the roof was just gone.
Okay.
And so that was the background place that still had really, and Jay Hammond had been the person who he and one or two other people had brought the body out of of that place, and so that was sort of an unnerving part of being there too for me at that age. And
how old were you again? Did you
I
say?
was probably 22 then.
A creative imagination as well.
Yeah.
So then, I guess, was that the beginning of working and doing more jobs of that kind of nature, building, making things from wood?
I did. I built a little apartment, a little two-bedroom apartment for Jay and Bella Hammond, close to their home in Naknek, Alaska. and then Jay would fly me up to their dream home, where they wanted to retire on Lake Clark, which ended up to be about 30 miles or so from where Dick Proenneke built his cabin on a different lake. And I built a bridge for Jay and Bella Hammond up there eventually, and which Dick heard about and liked, and so that's where I heard about Dick Proenneke and his legacy up Twin Lakes. And
so that's the moment, I guess, that your paths first crossed, right? Because I actually have that as a question to ask, and you got to it already. So thanks for saving me a job there. So did that mean that Dick Proenneke had hiked like 30 miles from his cabin at some point and just happened to see the bridge that you made?
He hiked everywhere. I mean, once in a while somebody would come and pick him up, and he would go to the nearest town, little bush community, and maybe do some mechanics work or use their road grader to grade the airstrip there, or build something for them, or hike 35 miles to some friends of his that had a gold mine, and we built a little cabin out there. And he would always hike those distances just as he would take off and just hike them. maybe with a sleeping bag sometimes not. Usually with his camera. And he had hiked down to, he had gone down to Jay and Bella's place to do some work for them, and prior to me building the bridge.
Okay.
And then when he had finished the work, then Jay had asked him if he could fly Dick back home, and Dick thanked him and said, "No, I hiked down here. I reckon I can hike back home." And so they
just turned down the opportunity to be flown back.
Yeah, 30 miles back home. And he just liked hiking. So that was the mythology around Dick Proenneke that I heard, of this man of the wilderness that had built his cabin out there with all hand tools and loved wildlife and hiked everywhere. And so one day I had been working there at Jay and Bella's homestead, and Jay had gone over and got Dick's mail and was going to fly up to see Dick one evening, and asked me if I wanted to go with him. And I had just really, really wanted to meet him from all the stories. And for some strange reason, what came out of my mouth was just to say, "Well, thanks for the offer, but when I meet Dick, it'll be when I walk in to see him." That's just what happened, what I said. And so that was really the first evening probably of really contemplating personally meeting Dick Proenneke.
Okay, so you hadn't thought about it before then? Really?
Well, maybe I had certainly loved the stories that Jay had said,
so
but
I hadn't really
concretely thought about, well, how do I do that? I had never thought about that. I had certainly never thought about hiking 75 miles through the wilderness, but then once I said that to Jay, then it was like formulating, well, when and how am I going to meet Dick?
Wow, 75 miles.
So the following summer, after Jay had offered me a free flight in, then it's all artificial. We all fly from Anchorage out to that part of Alaska in the first place. But I chartered an airplane from Jay Hammond's homestead to a lake about 40 miles north of Dick.
Okay.
Two rivers north of him.
Yeah.
And with my friend John Branson. And the two of us hiked down to Dick's place, and then spent the night with Dick, and then hiked on out to Jay and Bella's homestead.
Which is another 30 miles.
Yeah, so about 75 miles.
Okay. You're going way fast through this one, though. I want to hear about this adventure, because you did like 40-mile hike there, and you landed in that, I forget the lake name, forgive me.
Talaquina Lake we landed
Talaquina Lake.
Mm-hmm.
How was that hike? And so this was in the summer.
It was in this early summer, real early summer, and I wanted to do it because that hike between Talakuna and the whole hike was in the range of where there's a caribou migration that usually comes through there in the spring.
Okay.
And that's when they give birth to the calves.
Okay.
So I wanted it to double to see caribou.
Yeah.
And it ended up, again, I find myself, I feel like I'm living this life of blundering sometimes. That the flight up to Talakuna, we flew probably 15 miles across a alpine tundra that was completely covered in snow.
Okay.
In June.
Yeah. Is that normal?
No. It should have been melted out, but it wasn't. But we didn't formulate some other plan. We just got dropped off. And so we had 15 miles of snow to cover and had no special gear. We covered it all in one day. It was there was maybe 2 or 3 times that we would find 100 yards or a little bit that you actually walked on the top before you post hole through.
Oh, no.
And it was wet. It was
Wet snow.
It wasn't just wet snow. It had water underneath. It was so soggy that we were in ice water up to our knee the entire day. So from your feet to your knee was numb completely and no way to get out of it. And the only way that the thing that made it feasible was that it was a really warm day. The sun was out. It was exceedingly bright. And so we post-holed across there and eventually gave up our original route and changed direction 90 degrees, thinking it would be shorter. And it was. And we got out of it in a couple more miles and got down to tundra. And
okay, so you just dropped elevation slightly and it had melted off a bit.
Yeah. And so that was quite a harrowing adventure. And several, one place there on the ice was a creek that was seasonal, wouldn't have been a creek at all in the summer. It was runoff running in a trough of ice. So it was ice, just a glare ice bottom with ice sides. It was maybe only a foot or 16 inches of water.
Yeah.
Running pretty fast, but there was nothing to hold on to. And it was maybe 8 or 9 feet across. And we walked and walked and walked trying to find a place that was different than the 100 yards ahead that we had just passed. And it was just a trough of ice.
Yeah.
And so we crossed that.
But it's super slippy if it's ice underneath.
Oh, yeah. And if you slipped, then you were going to die. You were going to freeze to death because there was nothing to catch on the sides as far as we had gone.
Yeah.
And so there was, it was a strange time. We came on another little creek that was still completely frozen over, and it wasn't hard enough snow and ice on this creek to support our weight. And so we took off our packs and laid on our bellies and scooted the pack out in front of us and then crawled along on all four, keeping your stomach on the ice.
Yeah. And
pushed across that creek on that method, and that worked good. I mean,
did you hear it like cracking as you were going?
No, it was so soggy and stuff. Everything worked well, but there were all these little times that it could have gone differently.
It could have gone quite badly.
Yeah. Anyway, and we after I think 2 days of hiking, we had got to 2 days of hiking, we had reached the Twin Lakes drainage.
Okay.
And there was an old trapper's cabin downriver from Dick Proenneke. And there was a porcupine living in there, and we chased it out. And we stayed there one day because it rained really hard. And then we hiked up the lake shore, up the river, the Chillicothe River, and along the shore of Twin Lakes to meet Dick Proenneke. Yeah.
The funny thing is, having read your book, that there is the occasional journal entry from Dick talking about the moment that he...
Yeah, that we came in wet, like 2 drowned rats or something.
Yes, I remember. There's something like that. I wish I had it as a note in the book now, but maybe I'll do an excerpt and we can just hear what it sounds like. I'll read it out in a second. Right, just found the excerpt I was talking about. I'll give this a little read now. Bear with me. I'm not going to do any accents. June 6, 1982. Overcast, calm, and 40. I looked up to see John Branson and another backpacker come into view. It had to be Monroe, the expert cabinet maker and jack of all trades who was working for Jay at Miller Creek. The boy that built the nicest bridge of logs I've ever seen. They looked pretty sorry as it had been raining since morning. "Where have you guys been?" I greeted them. They got out from under their packs and came in. I asked them how the hike had gone till now. Not so good. Deep wet snow on the high tableland between Talacuna and Turquoise. Up to your pockets and some places lots of slush under it. About 7 miles of tough going. No caribou at Turquoise where Will Troyer and I had seen thousands last year. And the wind blew fierce and it rained. They had reached the lower end of the Twin the afternoon of the second day. They ran a porcupine out of old Frank Bell's cabin in the bend of the Chili River and moved in. The hikers had to pitch their tent inside because of the leaking roof. Stayed a day there while it rained and blew. Came up on my cabin in about 5 hours. It came evening and we trudged the beach to Spike's cabin. They would appreciate it after being rained on and wind blown for a couple of days. I uncovered the windows. Monroe put up the stovepipe above the roof. I left them and came down to have a light supper for myself. Monroe came down later to stay until near 10 o'clock. John was a little tired, he said. Monroe is interesting. Been many places in Alaska and western US and did many things. Now he has his own cabinet making business in town and has been working for Jay several summers. He told me that the fancy log bridge that he built across Miller Creek took about 12 weeks to build, counting from the start of the project, including the stone foundation. Time to turn in, and he trudged to the beach to the point. I called it a day, for I would be getting up early to see them off. Yeah, so what was your first impression of Dick at that moment, after hearing all of the mythology around him?
I guess the thing that made me I was most aware, the part that Jay Hammond had told me seemed just totally to fit this gentle man out there, and but John Branson gave me a lot of warnings about Dick, like that Dick went to bed really early, and we would have dinner with him and then go and get out of his hair, that he went to bed early and got up early, and so I think after dinner I went down and talked to Dick, and it just seemed like Dick liked to talk is maybe, I don't know who talked the most, if he did or I did. Maybe it was me, but I like to think it was Dick. I remember a few of his stories, and so that was really fun to spend the night in Dick's cabin just talking with him.
What was, can you remember one of the stories that he told you?
I remember 2 in particular. One, because it just struck me as that he said that he had built his cabin with just materials, and he wanted it to rot back into the ground when he was done, when he was finished living there, that it would... He had just used a little tiny piece of the wilderness,
yeah,
and not kept building beyond that. And he wanted it to be temporary, but he had built a rock fireplace. So I remember just thinking, well, the sort of the lack of one story to why did you put a rock fireplace in here if you want it to rot? And so that's something that I lived with and thought about a lot in spending 19 summers there, keeping Dick's, restoring his cabin and keeping it up and replicating the things, was that statement of intent that Dick personally had told me. And then how does that fit with being true to his legacy? And also just it was something very personal to me in being there for those years.
Yeah.
And thinking who was Dick to have that little discrepancy in his life. The other one, the really fun story he told, was about having seen a wolverine around his place and in the winter, and really wanting to see the wolverine up close. And so he put a little, I think it was a piece of moose meat out on the ice with a rope tied to it, and then through his window, and then tied it to his arm or leg and went to bed. And the wolverine came along and tugged on it and woke him up, and so he drugged the wolverine. They had a tug of war, and he drug it over to his window and then had his flashlight there and shined his light down on the wolverine. And that story that he told me is only a little snippet of the story, because he had different versions of that happened several different nights with that same wolverine.
The tug of war.
Yeah. And so that was really fun, because the wolverine is just such a mythical creature of the wilderness anywhere that it exists, including Alaska. And people live up there for years and years and never see one. And I know that I remember each of the half a dozen times or so that I was lucky enough to be around a wolverine and get to watch it for a while. Yeah, so
that's amazing.
That was a fun story.
So was it, so you just stayed one night there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you had to do the long hike back?
Yeah, well, continuing on.
Oh, yes, you went on.
And Dick hiked with John and I the first day until about noon, and then left us at a mountain pass that he sat up and watched us disappear down into a river valley. And yeah.
So that was the first time that you met Dick, and it was actually already some great stories. We'll jump in a lot more depth into the Dick Proenneke story, but there's a little bit more of your story that I'd love to ask you about, which is, you mentioned before that you went down to California after a while. You were in Alaska for quite a long time, and then got wind of a class that was being taken by James or Jim Krenov. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I guess a bit of context. James Krenov is a famous fine woodworker who, actually I didn't know this, but originally lived in Russia. And Scandinavia. I didn't know that. I thought that he was in Denmark maybe originally. No, Sweden, sorry. He was in Sweden for a while, but that's where I thought he came from. But actually Russia. It was interesting.
There's actually a photograph of him being a baby, being held in the arms of Amundsen on Amundsen's North Pole expedition.
Is there? Wow.
Mm-hmm.
How interesting.
So his mother, Jim's mother, was a school teacher in the Chukchi Sea area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I would love to hear some of your story about moving from Alaska, going down. I guess you got wind that James Krenov was going to be teaching. So you thought, I mean, you were already at that point an accomplished woodworker. You had a business, a cabinet business, didn't you, at that point? But you wanted to go and hone your craft more by going down and meeting this person who has quite a legendary reputation. How was that course? Did you find that your craft skills improved using hand tools?
Yes. Yeah, that just an amazing school, and I think it's still. I'm not close to it, but I think it still has the same reputation, a really stellar reputation that it did when Jim was there. Yeah, I don't know how I came across Dick's first book. I think it was called A Cabinet Maker's Notebook.
You mean James?
Yeah,
Jim
Krinoff's.
Yeah.
And but I do know the other 3 books that he wrote I got because I was enthralled with the first one, and when the other ones came out, I grabbed them. But I had always, once I heard of him, it's like I'd never really thought that there was anybody that I wanted to study woodwork from. But Jim working with hand tools was just exactly what I wanted to do. I use machines all the time, but to be able to be accomplished with hand tools, to be able to sharpen tools. A friend of mine, he and I would get together in Alaska during the winter time, and we would maybe make something, but more than anything else, it would be a few days of honing our craft skills. So learning to sharpen a hand plane or something like that, chisels, learn to use scrapers. And I would look at these books, especially from the arts and crafts movement, in the really early days of machine, but the arts and crafts, Barnsley workshops in England, and look at those pictures, black and white photos, and think, I can work my entire life with the best machines I have, and I could never match the craftsmanship of those pieces that I'm looking at. And I didn't like that. I didn't like what that said about our world. I thought, I'm really missing something personally. So when I heard that Jim was teaching on the Mendocino coast, I called down. That was during the second year of the school here. Oh, no, it was during the first year of the school. They were in the spring, towards the end of the first year, and they were just picking students for the second year. And I spoke to Jim on the phone and told him of my interest in coming, and I was really tired of using power sanders and having sawdust, sanding dust everywhere, and the noise of that, and just thought of how wonderful it would feel to use hand planes and scrapers to do your work and live in that quieter environment and do that work that I saw in the Barnsley photographs and then in Jim's books also. I speak of the Barnsley, I think, because their furniture, larger tables and china hutches and stuff, rather than the more petite, smaller cabinets of Jim Krinoff, which I think is awesome, but the Barnsley pieces are probably closer to what I have an interest in building.
Okay.
And Jim had told me that first year, he said, well, just come down, it's you could apply for this year, but why don't you just wait and come down here sometime and see the school during the second year of the school and see for sure that it's a place that you want to go, and if it works for you, you'd get in. And so that's what I did, and then applied for and went to the program in Fort Bragg during its third and fourth year. of operation. Yeah.
So what was your impression of California? Because is that the first time you've been there?
No, I had been to California before. As a child, we had done one vacation in California, more in Southern California.
Yeah.
No, I really loved the redwood forest. I fell in love with the redwood trees, and even though it was mostly stumps around here, but just was in awe of the redwood forest and wanted to spend more time in the redwood forest, not just as a visitor, but I wanted to have the redwood forest be part of my life. And but I was really drawn to here because Alaska has such a short growing season. I didn't mind the winter. I wasn't bothered by the severity of the winter at all. I like cold. But I really, really missed the longevity of the growing season up there.
Ah.
And so when I finished school here, I decided I really wanted to have a place and have my own garden and orchard and grow things here. And not the cannabis that's so widespread on the Mendocino coast. Not that I have anything against that, but that wasn't my interest. It was the trees, the fruit trees and berries and vegetables the year round.
I guess it's things I take for granted, having only really lived in California. But how long is a growing season in Alaska then? Would it just be the 2 or 3 months or?
Yeah, it depends on what altitude you are.
Yeah.
At sea level or close to sea level, it's probably, sometime in June, July, August, and then it could be freezing in September. Done. Yeah, and it really grows fast and some wonderful things. But fruit trees are, I guess there were people playing around with apple trees up there, and there are apples now that's grown up there, but when I was there, it was maybe a few crab apples, and that was about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was something you said there, which I wanted to ask you about, which is you were saying you were kind of, what's the word? Amazed and lured almost, like enthralled by the redwood trees. But also, and this is something I wanted to ask more about, is that there was a lot of unclaimed redwood that had been cut down by these stumps that hadn't ever been pulled out. I'm curious because that's certainly not the case now. You don't see a bunch of redwood laying around everywhere. But at the time when you were going down and studying, that was something you noticed?
I mostly, in driving the roads, would see the giant stumps, these great, huge stumps out along the roadsides with the second growth forest growing, and would walk out through there and visit the few remaining stands of old growth trees. But mostly I was exposed to these stumps, and I'm like, I don't know how, but I want that to be in my life. And so... Yeah, during the 1990s, I purchased a little wood miser sawmill and had an old flatbed truck, what had been a Pacific Gas and electric truck with a winch behind the cab, and would go out in the forest. And there was a lot of logs left in the forest originally, trees that were too small, maybe even 2 feet in diameter, but too small to bring in.
That had been cut down.
And there were trees that we brought out. The largest log we brought out was a single log left in the forest that was 17 feet in 17 feet long and 8.5 feet in diameter. And it was just laying there, and it had so much rot in it that they had left it there.
Okay.
And it probably didn't have any more rot when we found it, 80 years later, than it did when it was cut. And why they had taken the rest of the tree out and left that one, I don't know. So every log had its own story. And then the early days of logging here, all of the logs originally were taken down the rivers here.
Yes.
And so there was a sawmill at the ocean at every river along the coast here, and all the little creeks also. Little River, where we are, which is you can just hop across,
Yeah.
had a sawmill there
Huh.
until in the early 20th century. And so logs were floated down, and in the larger rivers, then the specific gravity of the wood close to the stump of redwood, so the bottom logs were really close to the specific gravity of water. And so many of those logs, when they were floating down the river, sunk. And there was plenty of logs for the sawmill to be sawing, and so those logs just sunk and stayed right there and got covered up with the silt that was being eroded out because of the logging activity.
Okay.
And were covered. And so during the years that I was logging, and all during the 90s, or from 92 to 99, there were operations of people going in with little barges of sorts and winching those logs out of the river bottoms and then bringing them down to Mendocino or into Fort Bragg and putting them on a logging truck.
Okay.
And so I didn't ever do that, but I bought quite a few of those logs they're called sinkers.
Yes, and it's a very different look to it, right?
Yeah, they can look really similar to ebony, in fact, with a lot of black streaks, or be almost black wood.
Very distinctive.
Purple wood. Yeah, so that was...
So it's ended up being quite valuable, sinker redwood, right? But it's not very common anymore. Is that right?
It's not common at all anymore, because it's not... and I have mixed feelings about even the logs that we took out of the forest. When we were in the forest taking logs out, we would arrive in the morning and leave home at 7 or something and drive into the forest and leave our truck there and take a walk, usually separately, and then rendezvous back at the truck in an hour and a half or something, and talk it over, and then go and one of us or both of us had seen some logs, and the forest had been picked over.
Yeah.
By all those salvage logs had been taken out of the forest, except in the very extreme steep places, in gullies and stuff. So we were the last generation to pick over, to find something, all the way down to taking one off the side of a cliff that we went down on cables, and I went down on the cables and did the work, and my partner sucked it up to the road.
Using the winch on the truck,
winch,
which is, I think you said, like a 20,000 pound winch.
Yeah, a 5/8 inch steel cable.
Wow.
And there were logs that were probably just pushed over by bulldozers when they were making the road into where we were going, decades before, because there were a few trees that were entire trees,
just pushed
that
over.
The stump included, that didn't look like they had. Redwoods typically break off if the wind is too hard. Sometimes they'll blow the stump out, but not very often. And the sinker wood was really nice wood, because it was usually stump, the bottom few logs of the tree, and there would be no knots in that wood. It would be absolutely clear lumber that you would be sawing. And some of the logs that we found in the forest was that way also. And other logs would be more the logs from the tops of trees that had a lot of knots in it. And so our business was selling clear old growth lumber here. I still have some of it here. And people, and our saws sawed boards up to 28 inches wide. And so our business was mostly clear, vertical grain, old growth wood.
Wow.
Up to 28 inches wide. and like I had quite a few orders for 1x12s. I think I only had one order in all those years for 1x10. So I had a lot of 1x10s and 1x8s, 1x6s left over. And so like on my house that I'm remodeling and put all new siding around it, all the drip line sides is all 1x10s. All the gable ends that have more vertical height to them is all 1x8. And that narrower board emphasizes the verticalness of those walls. So my house remodel is pretty much using wood that didn't have much of a commercial value.
Yes.
But has ended up to be just working with this wonderful, wonderful, rich wood. All the window frames, the casings I make out of just little pieces glued together. Some of it with knots or cracks in one side, but put those in a place that the stop that's holding the window is going to hide all the glue joints. So what you're looking at my house, it's not all clear old growth lumber, but it looks like it is. And it totally fills, when I think back on it just now with you, it just totally fills that spirit energy that I had when I first arrived on the coast of having the redwood forest be part of my home, part of my work. And in the process, getting a little old growth fir doesn't tend to last. It rots right away. So I think we only found 3 old growth fir trees in all that time that were still good.
Salvageable.
And so my kitchen cabinets are made out of it, and a few other things. Some of the baseboard and trim around the doors and windows, and some of it's redwood. And then I've used a lot of Monterey cypress and Mendocino cypress and acacia and pine and nutmeg, it's not the spice wood, it's another conifer that grows here on the Mendocino coast. So my home is built out of all local woods here.
Amazing. Yeah, stunning. It's definitely, as soon as I arrived, it's got that lovely feeling of, you can sense the craft and everything here. It's beautiful. I have you mentioned one thing earlier, right at the beginning of our conversation, and I think we'll start winding up soon. I've already taken a lot of your time, but you mentioned about, when I gave a list of all the things that you have done, you mentioned about doing some conservation work, protecting redwoods and planting seedlings. Can you tell me a bit about that? Because you were going through the forest, pulling out. And it must be very rewarding as well, also salvaging all that wood and making use of it rather than it kind of rotting despite being cut down by other people. But when did you start feeling the motivation to protect the old growth trees and try and plant more seedlings?
Probably the first day that we went out in the forest. I think both of us thought about it, that it would be a way to make a living that would feel good to us. And I want to give the credit to my partner, Roger Moore. The very first day that we went out, we sat by the truck and had a little conversation about what are we doing out here. And Roger's the one who spoke that our time in the forest was a give and take with the forest. It wasn't a taking. And I remember thinking that it felt more like a taking. But his stating that was something that stayed with, I think, both of us every day that we were in the forest. That we were taking trees that were already down, but when we would go out and do our hikes, then we would find a log and describe it to each other. And there were logs, quite a few logs, that would have been wonderful logs to take out, that one or both of us said no, that we don't want to take that log out. For whatever reason, it just felt like you didn't want to take. I remember one was a real old log that you could tell that it was not a log that was left by forester, loggers, but one that had fell down naturally before logging Europeans ever came to the coast.
Yeah.
And that one I didn't want to touch, and we didn't. And there was another one that had been cut down by loggers, and there was a dusty-footed wood rat that lived in it, and I didn't want to bother the dusty-footed wood rat. And so there were plenty of logs that we didn't take. And there was one tree that, and I don't remember why, but there was one tree that we took that I regretted taking, and I thought, I shouldn't have taken that one. And I think it was more the dusty-footed wood rat story.
Okay.
Yeah, that something lived there, and I was disturbing it. But, that give and take, every day that we were out there, we ended the day by taking a 30-gallon garbage can and walking up and down, not a can, a sack.
Yeah.
And walking up and down the road and picking up garbage for a while. And we were very careful. I don't think we ever nicked the bark off of any other tree when we were pulling a log in through the forest on the ground for hundreds of yards, that we would block and tackle off of some other tree in a pad around the tree, wrap a rope around it or a cable, and then block and tackle so that we would pull our log in a way that didn't injure live trees. And our pulling logs would sort of pull up huckleberry or little salal or plants that were growing ferns, and probably kill those.
Yeah, undergrowth.
Make a little groove in the forest, and since we were always working on a slope, then rains would come and make a little gully there. But every single pull that we made, we would come back in with shovels and rakes and rake organic material back over that and heal that wound to the ground before we left that day.
Yeah.
With no exceptions. And we put out one little fire that some campers had left that probably wouldn't, but could have spread into a larger fire. And we stopped. I remember one day these two big guys stopped and they were unloading some appliance that they were dumping off, and I stopped and confronted them and was very threatened by stopping myself to do that. And but we took care. We treated it as our forest. It was our forest. It's all of our forest. And then that involved going and planting hundreds of new little seedlings. Not that we had to, or the state forest asked us to, or require. It's what we wanted to do.
Yeah.
And in one place where the only time that we found a place that 3 old-growth redwoods had fallen because of a creek that had flowed in a different route than its traditional stream bed because of early logging decades before. And then that creek washing in a new route had undermined these 3 trees, and they had fallen, and it looked like that was going to keep happening. And so we rebuilt a section of, 100, 150 yards of creek with pick and shovel.
Wow.
Back into its old stream bed, and then put organic material. It was a little tiny creek, but it spread out and did a lot of damage that the forest wasn't used to.
Yeah.
Erosion. And bermed up against it, and then planted little trees along the side of that old stream bed that we brought it back into. And then I went back there every single winter for probably 10 years during the rainy season when there was a lot of water.
Yeah.
And at least the first few years, then the creek was trying to jump out of that old established bank and go where it was going to erode some more redwood trees. And so the running water allowed me to get down in the creek and muddy it up, but keep it confined into that traditional stream bed.
Yes.
And until it found its way and really reestablished that old creek bed. And that felt really good. That felt as, and nobody asked us to do that.
Yeah. That was just your own motivation.
Yeah.
I'm curious, all the while this was happening and you were living in California, learning a different approach to fine woodworking with tools and then pulling big redwood trees out of, salvaging redwood trees out of the forest. Were you keeping in touch with Dick Proenneke at that point? Were you corresponding through letters?
Yeah, I was. Maybe only, I don't know how many, but from 82 until he died in 2003, maybe every other year on average. So not a lot.
Yeah, but you were keeping in touch.
Yeah, and on a somewhat regular basis, consistently throughout that time. And, yeah. And I have those letters, and to talk about Dick a little more, he had a way of, because he lived by himself so far in the wilderness and no radio and no telephone, he used his letter writing as a way to travel, to go places and see things. He asked pointed questions about the Mendocino coast and about Jim Krinoff's work and about Jim Krinoff the person, in a way that let me know that that's how Jim had his relationships that fed, nurtured him, was through those correspondences. And he wrote really long letters. His little letters were not 1 or 2 pages. They were like 6 or 8 page letters every time, written on both sides. Yeah, long letters about mostly about wildlife with me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like through all that correspondence, it wasn't until 1999 that Dick left.
Correct.
The cabin. And it was shortly after that you were invited to come up and the whole project of maintaining and restoring Dick's cabin began.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I guess this is some foreshadowing now. Also, where you happen to meet your wife as well.
Exactly. That's
which is
the best part.
Which is a whole story that I really want to hear. I think that's going to be a very good beginning for our next episode.
Good.
But I want to say thank you for your time today, Monroe. That was amazing. It was really fun to roll up our sleeves and hear all of the stories and the experiences that you had to, make you who you are and get you to the point where we're about to get to in the story now. I guess there's one little thing maybe as we wrap up. Your book, The Handcrafted Life of Dick Proenneke. How can people find that book if they want to cheat and get read before they hear the next episode? Is there a place where they can go and find that, or what's the best way that people can do that?
Well, let's see. It was published. There's probably 3 ways. The publisher, which is Lost Art Press,
Okay.
If one Googled the handcrafted life of Dick Proenneke, then that would lead you to Lost Art Press, and you can purchase it through Lost Art Press.
Okay.
And I think here on the Mendocino coast, the Gallery bookstore, I believe, handles this book.
Okay. Great.
In Mendocino. And if somebody really wanted a signed copy, then I would be more than willing to sign a book for people, and they could get a hold of me at Monroe, MONROE, at mcn.org.
Okay, perfect.
And probably title it The Handcrafted Life of Dick Proenneke.
Great.
Yeah.
And maybe, I don't know if I'm stepping too far, but if they have any questions or if they want to reach out to you and just ask you anything about the podcast or your life and stories, I'm guessing that would be okay for them to send you a message?
Certainly. Yeah, certainly about my life or this podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, and about Dick Proenneke, maybe less so, because I think there's probably a million questions about Dick Proenneke, and most of them can be answered
in the book,
or by watching one of the videos or some other way. And I really don't want to spend my life answering Dick Proenneke questions. I love answering a few. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to get it to where that's my life.
Yeah, well, then that makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, this has been really fun.
Well, I look forward to the next one.
Okay, next time.
Right, that's another episode done. A big thank you again to Monroe for the great conversation, and also putting me up in your home for a few hours and putting up with all my questions. You can find all the links on how to find his book, The Handcrafted Life of Dick Proenneke, down in the show notes, and also how to reach out to him if you want to ask more questions. I also want to give a big thanks again to all the listeners. If you enjoyed the episode, then please do all the things that people do with podcasts. Give us a follow, like, subscribe. Even if you're feeling generous, share with a friend. You can also follow us on social media. There's more links down at the bottom of the podcast, all the info there. You'll see the normal entry, and then at the very bottom there's like a footer with the extra social things for this specific podcast. Okay, lots more interesting stuff on the pipeline. I've got some great guests lined up. I'm excited. They're going to be out soon, but that's all for now. Until next time.